what we're going to do, first of all, what did we do last time? Last time we also did some abstract stuff. We talked about the inactive approach in cognitive science. And we connected it very closely to Buddhist philosophy, specifically, right, Madhyamaka philosophy and sort of notion of emptiness and groundlessness, right, and we looked at some of the parallels between the ways in which inactivism conceives of cognition and in the ways in which Buddhist philosophy conceives of cognition. Not making these two the same, but making them similar enough, and really acknowledging the debt that inactivism has to the Madhyamaka framework, which is explicit. It's in there in the literature. It's just people often forget that. With all that background, this sets us up nicely to think about consciousness, right? The question of that we all very naturally have, right? Probably if you're thinking about cognitive science, you're interested in consciousness in some way, shape, or form. You're kind of interested in the mystery of it. Or maybe you're interested in, can science ever explain consciousness? If you're of a more, humanistic, humanities, spiritual background, you obviously are very interested in consciousness because the whole process is really just how far can we push this consciousness thing, right? How conscious can we get of ourselves, the world, how we suffer, how we can come out of suffering. The basic idea there is that consciousness seems to be what is behind all perceptions. It is the kind of illumination required to perceive, not just visually, but with any sense modality, at all, right? It's, again, so the analogy is like a fire casts a light on an object, so consciousness is this kind of illumination that allows anything to show up in experience at all. Okay? So the key dimension for thinking about consciousness is gross and subtle. And we've mentioned this before, right? Remember when we talked about dukkha, gross dukkha, subtle dukkha? It's the same idea, right? Obviously gross states of consciousness, subtle states of consciousness, right? So your access to your thoughts is more subtle. There's even deeper, subtler layers, right? Your access to overall qualities of your awareness. You can be aware of that. That's hard, right? Now, we can connect that in this course to ideas like, the minimal self or the basic subject-object structure of things. Like we are self-absorbed, right? We tend to view ourselves as separate from the world, and this is happening at a very subtle level, right? And it takes a lot of work to see ourselves in any other way, as like connected or as wider. Like we are aware of so much more than we can put into words. And my favorite of those pieces of awareness right now is you're aware how far away to stand from people. And that's not just like a one rule, like it's also modulated by things like, how well you know the person, various implicit and explicit dominance hierarchies and all sorts of stuff. So it's like you are, there's a kind of, your consciousness is clued into that in some ways. When you're doing, let's say, metacognition, you can apprehend the quality of your thinking, right? Like, am I being, when we do metta later, it'd be like, am I actually doing metta or am I not doing metta? You can actually know that, right? So the third thing, so reflexivity. So, and this is the most controversial aspect of the analysis of consciousness. So reflexivity is that consciousness, in the course of making things appear, makes itself appear. Okay, there's a sort of reflexivity there. Like, one of the things that shows up in consciousness is consciousness. So in deep and dreamless sleep, just to answer your question, what might be happening is consciousness is grasping literally nothing but itself. And everything else, or most other things, are just kind of excluded from that. Okay, that's a possibility. So I said that consciousness is reflexive. That is the most controversial claim that I've made so far. Philosophers are, I don't know if they're evenly split, but like rivers of ink have been spilt arguing about whether that makes sense or not. Okay? So there's basically, and this is both in Indian philosophy and in Western philosophy, but primarily in Indian philosophy because they've just been at it for much longer. So the question is consciousness self-illuminated or other-illuminated? So other illumination might seem like a sensible view, right? In order for conscious experience to be revealed, there needs to be a higher level cognition of that experience. So this is the idea of, like, maybe, just for intuition. So, you're aware of lots of things right now. And there's a bunch of things in your peripheral awareness that maybe you're kind of aware of, but not fully. But you can make your peripheral awareness focal, right? You know that trick where you're looking at something, but you're actually paying attention to someone else, that sort of spy trick. So that sort of thing. So that suggests, right, there's a sort of there's something going on within consciousness to illuminate what was previously unilluminated, right? So that sort of move suggests that there might be some truth to this. The problem is, there's a philosophical problem there, which is a vicious regress. So here's the question, right? So if state 1's not conscious just by itself, how on earth can state 2, which of course isn't conscious because nothing's observing it, how can adding 2 non-conscious states, right, by hypothesis, because in order to be conscious, a state has to be illuminated by another state. So how can adding 2 unconscious states together generate a conscious state?